All right, people, it is almost 11 a.m. on this fine Sunday morning. It is May 1st. We are officially 4 months into the year of 2022, and I'm joined once again by Eli to talk about probably Eli's favorite show of the last couple of years. We convened a couple months ago in order to talk about this back in January when the first 7 episodes of this final season dropped. It is probably going to be the last Netflix show that people are going to be talking about, at least to this high of a caliber, for a while. It is the final 7 episodes of Ozark that we are talking about today. We are bidding another show adieu. And Eli, do you have any thoughts before we get this thing started?
I just want to say it's been a wild ride. I've been following this show since first week of the first season was out, and I gotta say, I'm feeling all kinds of emotions right now.
Yeah, we are indeed feeling a lot of emotions after this finale. I'm gonna break the ice right now. Not necessarily all of them good, but we're gonna discuss all of that and more on today's episode of the Talking TV podcast. Stay tuned. Oh, man, what an interesting spot to be in as far as being a TV fan goes. What's up, people? Welcome back to another episode of the Talking TV podcast. We're live on Twitch right now. If you guys are watching us right now, be sure to click the follow button. If you're not already subscribed to us on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to us on there as well. Talking TV podcast. And be sure to follow us across all of our social media platforms, as well as follow this guy across everything that he's got going on in his fledgling internet career. So, Eli, it's finally over. We have to say goodbye to another TV finale. It's such a weird state to be a TV fan right now, because on the one hand, you have all these TV shows that are trying to move in more so towards movies, and then on the other, towards like kind of being more so like stretched out movies. And then on the other hand, you have certain of those fledgling shows on the streamers that are trying to keep alive the idea of traditionalist TV. And Ozark is a little bit of a weird one because Ozark came in right past the breaking point. It was like kind of the first of this new era of shows that we were going to get that Netflix was putting out, and kind of like, post the House of Cards heyday right there. And for a while, this was a really interesting, it was kind of a new and different show, and kind of tried to signify like a different direction that we were going. And I talked a lot last time about kind of how, kind of how pulpy and ridiculous the show ended up being as it continued to go on after its initial inception. But I wanted to start this conversation off today with a conversation about, man, what a great time it is to be a TV fan right now, because you got Ozark ending. You have all of these shows coming back after having been delayed. Some of them roughly 2 to 3 years since the pandemic. You have Barry literally just premiered last week. Better Call Saul, we got back a couple weeks ago. Atlanta came back after a 4-year wait time. So just talk about that for a second. What does it mean right now to be like a fan of television? Like what does that mean right now in the era of streaming?
Well, there's no shortage of content, especially right now with every major show just coming back these last few months. Obviously, you mentioned Better Call Saul. Super stoked for that. Oh my gosh, it's just a flood of content. I'm not even sure what to watch half the time. There's just so many to pick from.
Well, it's so interesting because, again, in the decade of streaming where there's so much content to watch, there's so many different streaming services, people don't know what to pay for right now. People don't know what's even worth paying for because just everything seems so interchangeable. I guess the reason why I bring that up is because all these shows coming back kind of signifies like a time when it's like, there almost like was kind of this new group of shows that were coming out, where coming off of the peak prestige era of the late 2000s, early 2010s, where you had, again, like Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones, Lost was wrapping up, all these different shows that were coming on. And you had all these shows that kind of premiered roughly around the same time, circa 2016, 2017. You had Stranger Things in Atlanta in 2016. You had Ozark, Glow 1 year later in 2017. Better Call Saul was a couple years before that. But all these shows and then obviously Succession and Barry were the most recent ones added to that batch, both premiering in 2018. And then pretty much all those shows, between a combination of just their shooting schedules because of the stars that they had involved, and then a big reason of being the pandemic, all those shows just kind of went away for a while. And it was really weird because I was talking about this actually with Sean on our Better Call Saul podcast a couple of weeks ago, where you had all these shows that went away for a certain amount of time, and you had this flood of new content that came in, some of which had already been produced right before the pandemic set, and some of which were produced during the pandemic. So it felt like you almost, like, for a brief period, were almost in this new like pandemic era of television. And now you have all these shows coming back all of which have been affected as a result of the pandemic. Like you have a lot of these shows have now split their final, some of which are majority of which are in their final seasons. You have them splitting it into 2 parts. Atlanta's final 2 seasons are both airing this year. Better Call Saul is split into 2 parts. Stranger Things, which finally is coming back after another 3-year gap, that's being split into 2 seasons. And then you have this experiment continue with this show where they took their last season of 14 episodes and split it into 2 batches of 7 across a couple different months, very similar to what Breaking Bad and Mad Men and The Sopranos did with their final seasons. But interestingly enough, even though they air in the same calendar year, and even though there were events that happened in the last 7 episodes that directly affect this 7 episodes, it still kind of feels like 2 different seasons of a TV show. So, like, real quick before we get into like the conversation about the show, so because this is the thing that I'm constantly trying to figure out whenever they do this, where they split a final season of a TV show to 2 parts. Do you consider this season 4 part 1 and part 2, or is it like, no, this is just season 4 and 5?
It honestly, to me personally, it feels more like a 5th season, just kind of picking right up from where we left off with the end of the last one. I don't know, just the whole tone and just overall mood I felt of this season was a little different from what they were kind of pushing for last season, and that may not necessarily mean a bad thing, but I don't know, it just didn't feel like there was as much, I guess, intensity this time around versus last season, where it kind of felt like everything was finally culminating together and shit was finally hitting the fan, like, pretty hard. And then, I don't know, this season, it just seemed like there wasn't as much at stake, and it kind of just felt like they took a step back in terms of scale and just overall, I guess, threat, if that makes sense.
Which is kind of interesting because that's kind of the opposite of what you would expect from the last season, right? This is it. This is the final 7. This is when like shit should be hitting the wall. Things should be like at their most tense. They should be like building up to this like really, really intense and explosive finale. And I think that kind of the consensus that we both came to after watching that final episode yesterday, that 14th and final episode of this whole season, was kind of just, what? Like, what happened? It's so strange because after seemingly an entire couple decades of just disappointing show finale after disappointing show finale, where it just felt like they just couldn't get it right for whatever reason. And obviously now we've had a little bit of time, roughly 3 years now since our last disappointing finale, of course, the much epitomized Game of Thrones. And so it's so beyond disappointing when you feel like you're past that point. You feel like you're finally past the point where they would like kind of television show writers would kind of fall victim to this trope of having the unsatisfying finale and just kind of not knowing what to do, really. And so you can imagine our disappointment when they kind of do it again here, where you have all the seeds to have a really badass, really explosive, really awesome finale, and they kind of just miff it and half-ass it. And you're kind of left with this feeling of just, what the hell happened? Now, I'll say this, that for me personally, this is not nearly as egregious as something like Game of Thrones, because Ozark had kind of taken a turn for me a while ago. We kind of discussed this the last time we were talking about part 1, where yours and I, my thoughts are very, very different on the show. I kind of view it more as like pulp entertainment, where it's like, I'm not necessarily watching this because I think it's one of the best shows on the air right now, but I definitely know that when I watch it, I know I'm going to be entertained as hell. Kind of like when I was watching Sons of Anarchy. Like after a certain point with Sons of Anarchy, I was just like, this is not like one of the best shows on the air right now. This is just pulpy soap opera nonsense, but it's so goddamn entertaining. So I kind of can't help but watch it. That's kind of where I was for a certain point. Like once we got into season 3, I'm like, oh, we're in silly territory now, But like I was kind of okay with it because I'm like, look, at the very least, the show kind of knows what it is now, and it's not trying to pretend to be like this really prestige-y, like, oh, super weighty, heavy show. That's kind of why I never really bought into the Breaking Bad comparisons, only because maybe the first season, maybe season 2, maybe, but like after a certain point, like the show just kind of like got into a level of like just pulp and soap opera-y territory and just kind of like basic writing standing that I just feel like Breaking Bad never stooped to. And that's kind of why I never really bought into the comparison between the two. But I guess just what I'm trying to figure out here is, now that it's finally over, now that, we've spent a long time with this show. Like it's kind of crazy to think about it in hindsight, especially because it feels like this is on Netflix. This is the streaming service, obviously, that started all, but we also know this is the streaming service that is known for just canceling shows off the whim. They won't even give a show even half a chance if it doesn't get the traction. I mean, they cancel, but then they'll also like give a green light to second seasons of shows that everybody vehemently hated. Like they canceled Space Force, but they still gave it a second season. So look, we're not here to question or debate the semantics of Netflix right now, because we all know that they're kind of going through a lot of problems in their own. But I guess just, Eli, run me through your thought process after that final episode. I mean, we were in the same room, we were watching it at the same time. Run me through the thought process, because you were pretty stoked for the most part on this final season when it started.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really thought these first few episodes of this season were really good, and I was excited to see where they were going to take things, especially after the big moment in that first episode. But it just kind of feels like, as we were kind of approaching like the last two episodes or so, I'm just like, it just feels like they have a little too much to wrap up. I'm just kind of getting worried, and it just didn't seem like they were maybe in the place they should have been for their, the climax of their story, if that makes sense. Especially with Marty and Wendy, I just felt like, I don't know, with Marty, it just seemed they weren't as focused on things that they should have been. With the cartel, it seemed like they were giving more priority to the kids, which I completely understand, but it's not just the kids' lives at stake. It's, all they could all be dead if they don't do what needs to be done. And I don't know. Sometimes there were moments throughout the last season where it just seemed they were kind of attacking from way too many different angles, and it kind of felt a little like convoluted and just conjuncted. I don't know.
I think for me, the most difficult thing about these last couple of episodes is just that they had not really like a path that they could have pursued, but they had like a lot of different and interesting story directions. They were kind of, doing the things that you see a lot of final seasons of TV shows do. They were bringing in kind of all the previous characters and, all the different montages. They were kind of flashing back and referencing to all the different things that they had done over the course of the show, which again, depending on the show, you can make an argument as to whether or not it's, self-indulgent or whether it's actually like kind of meaningful and interesting storytelling. But for a minute there, especially like you said, after that jaw-dropping moment that happened in the first episode, which was not at all expecting, like it finally seemed like the show was going to come to like a really interesting conclusion after, for what I thought was a pretty damn good start to the final season. This is called, despite my thoughts on season 3, I actually thought that the first 7 episodes, as ridiculous and as much fun as they were, I actually really, really enjoyed where they were going. It felt like they were finally going to get into a spot where they were like kind of actually going to bring all of the stuff that the Byrdes had gone through over the course of the show to like a rather interesting conclusion. Because thematically, right, we're talking about the reason why I say that Ozark is kind of the beginning of this new stretch of shows is because if you look at all these shows that have come out kind of since Ozark premiered, like I said, it's Ozark, Better Call Saul, Barry, Succession. All those shows, the reason why I kind of grouped them together is because those shows kind of signified a new turn in the traditionalist, like anti-hero TV movement that had been started, obviously, at the beginning of the last 2 decades, with The Sopranos, that started, which is where that decade of TV viewing was all about anti-heroes. It was people who, yeah, they may have done some dirty stuff, but for the most part, you could root for them still because you could understand their motivations. And these new batches of shows have kind of taken that in a different direction, where now it's almost like these new batch of shows are in like a competition with their audience to see how long they can keep them invested for, where they're like, okay, we're going to make these guys as despicable and as unlikable as humanly possible. And we're just going to keep ramping that up over the course of the seasons, where you see that with Barry, you see that with the Succession, you see that to an extent with Better Call Saul, and this show is kind of like the prime movement of it, where over the course of the show you just see these characters becoming more and more despicable as they just continue to just like kind of settle into their position and understand that the choices that they've made are of their own making, but at the same time they know that they can like either double down, or they could or because they understand that they kind of have no other option because their lives are literally on the line every second. Like, it was certainly an interesting development, and that was probably the thing that kept me invested the most. But like, I guess the reason why, for me personally, these last couple episodes are just so unsatisfying narratively is because they ultimately do what so many other shows have done in the past, which is that they ultimately do not double down and try to have any sort of conclusion. They try to have their cake and eat it too. They just try to accomplish like everything at once. They're just like, oh, this is going to happen. And oh, these characters are going to overcome this. And oh, but then this other thing is going to come up and they can't really seem to overcome this. But then some magical force of God is going to come up, because this show has always been about like overcoming whatever ridiculous different thing is going to come from it. And like, it was good at first, but after a certain point, it just started to become like, okay, like what are we doing here? This is really started to get ridiculous. And I guess just that it's almost like the show felt like it was intentionally messing around with us, where it was introducing all these different plot threads that felt like they were actually going to like wrap up in a really, really interesting capacity, and then just pulling it back. Oh, that car wreck that you saw at the beginning of the season. Okay, we have it now. What's going to come of that?
Yeah.
What's going to come of that? Absolutely nothing. Okay, we have this awesome death, and what's going to result in? Oh, so it's not going to end like actually like interestingly narratively. Like there's only so much we can like kind of dive around before we get into spoilers, and we will get into spoiler territory. But like you see what I'm saying here as far as that goes?
No, I completely agree. I just felt like whatever was going on with the writers or with COVID, it just seemed like they either rushed this ending or they just weren't sure of what to do with several characters. And it really shows. I mean, I think about a few characters in particular we'll get into obviously in a few moments, but like just you didn't even see them in that final episode and you're just like, huh. They were kind of left in an interesting spot, kind of wondered what's going to happen to them or, what were they even up to after that, when we last
Right.
saw them.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too, also that if we're talking about that final episode, that kind of fell victim to is what I've seen a couple different times is it didn't feel like a finale of the whole show. It just felt like another season finale, like it was setting up for
Yep.
like just in case we can get all these guys back for one more season. And I'm like, why? You already told us this was the last season. Like, I never understand why shows do that. It's like they're constantly like, and of course, this is just the business of Hollywood in general, but it's almost always like, okay, even though we said that this is over, we're going to leave a few threads that way that there just might be something that we can come back to at a later point, because this is one of the few shows that people like actually watch and actually like talking about. It's just it's just certain old Hollywood tropes and tricks that I thought that we were done with and I thought was over with. And unfortunately, no, they're still rearing their ugly head even a full like 10 years after Lost. And I really thought that we were done. I thought that we were done with this kind of story, with this kind of thing after Lost, but no, unfortunately, they are still doing it first and foremost. So let's get into spoiler territory. Let's break it down. So this season picks up directly after the events of the last, or rather the first part of this season. You have Marty and Wendy, kind of settling into their new deal with the FBI and Javi. Ruth is on the warpath after obviously Javi quite viciously killed her cousin and Darlene, and for me, one of the most satisfying TV deaths that I've seen in a minute, because as I famously cheered after that finale, I was like, ding dong, the bitch is dead. It was the best. It was so great. That was a character that was such a waste of space and did not need to stick around like at all after all. And I thought the funniest part too was when Javi brought up in the first episode, it's probably the most legit point of this entire season. He's like, yeah, she should have been taken care of after she killed Dell. And I'm like, thank you. Like I love when TV shows can like kind of validate like a criticism that I have, but they just kind of throw it out into the ether. Not that it makes any much of a difference, but you can imagine our surprise when it was teased in the trailers and we all thought, okay, this is going to be a Kendall moment from the season 3 finale of Succession. They're not actually going to go through with this, but lo and behold, to our surprise, we were both shocked when Ruth actually killed Javi and was successfully able to blackmail Marty and Wendy in their new deal with Claire, and how that, and in order to kind of lure Javi into this trap so that she could ultimately shoot and kill him. And what results from that is yet again another mess that the Byrdes have to work their way out of, that involves more political maneuvering and also maneuvering around family members, as the, in my opinion, the complete just waste of an opportunity for the Byrdes. The investigator Mel Saddam, who was kind of poking around Helen, poking around for looking for Helen last season, and is now fully involved in the investigation into Wendy's brother Ben, which also unfortunately brings back Wendy's father, who was introduced for the first time last season. And now we get to get more context as well there. And of course, everything's still rumbling and going on with the cartel. And what's called after the FBI, after Maya Miller, unfortunately, kind of screwed their original deal by having Navarro in prison. So you got a lot of threads. You have a lot of threads that you have to wrap up here. And what ultimately comes of it is, once again, Marty and Wendy cheating through several acts of God, managing to make their way through. The kids kind of just once again fumbling around. I thought there was this one really hilarious moment where at the end of episode 4, Marty and Wendy get into a fight with a random driver, and the kids have to bail them out of jail at the beginning of next episode. Like we were laughing hard when that moment happened. And I'm like, okay, so this is what annoys me, because these are the moments where it's like, the show is kind of trying to be about something where it's like, okay, the adults are kind of like so just unaware of what they're doing that the kids have to like constantly bail them out, where you have this really hilarious moment where Jonah and Charlotte are literally just emulating their parents, where Jonah with the money laundering aspect and Charlotte kind of with like the sociability aspect. And I'm like, there's something actually here. There's something kind of really interesting here that we could pursue as far as just like, again, like it felt like what the show was sort of trying to be about in those first couple seasons is kind of like the damaging effects. You know how you always hear it, where it's like, you know, the anti-hero, it's the excuse, it's every single excuse that the anti-hero gives. It's like, oh, we're doing this for our families. But now the interesting thing that Ozark kind of started is kind of showing like the actual effects of that on the family and like what they're doing. And yeah, it got a little bit ridiculous in soap opera, but like I always thought that Jonah and Charlotte's usage in this show was kind of like underrated, but also undervalued as well. And now it seems like, aside from turning Jonah into just like Wendy's critic without actually doing anything, which once again proves that he's the best character on the show, now instead they've kind of relegated Charlotte to just doing nothing. And they're officially like, oh, okay. Like they had like a really interesting spot to be like, okay, where she's kind of like the one innocent. What if something actually happened to her? And no, they don't do anything, you know? And that's before we even get into the Ruth of it all, where Ruth is probably at the most interesting she's been since the first season, where you have this character who has literally lost everything. You know, Wyatt being killed last season is kind of like, it's literally just her and 3. Like every other member of her family has been killed directly because of her involvement in the Byrdes, with the Byrdes. And you have the potential for what could be a really interesting character arc where she's trying to get over the trauma of her past. She's trying to like move their family into a more advantageous spot. You know, she actually manages to pull some moves on Marty as far as like, you know, actually getting some pretty well-deserved revenge against the Byrdes because of all the stuff that they've done with her. And even to the point where they actually bring back a character that I wasn't expecting them to do. They bring back Rachel, from who hadn't been seen since season 2 after the whole petty of it all went down, and Marty was able to help her, which I was like, oh man, I missed that character. One of the very, very few actually likable characters on this entire show, you know? And they bring her back, and I don't know, Eli, what does it all amount to with all this? I'm still trying to figure that out. I really am.
I really did like Ruth's arc in this last part of, you know, this season, and I think her bringing back Rachel was honestly a good move on the writer's end, and it kind of brings some closure to, you know, Rachel's arc too. Kind of like, you know, she was going to leave. She was going to leave it all behind. Obviously, you know, she was opening up businesses still. She never really left her roots. And I felt like it was a good way for her to kind of, you know, reach a point where, you know, after all she's been through, you know, she didn't really deserve it. Marty just kind of came into her life and she got dragged into this mess. And I feel like it's partially deserved on Rachel's part to be in the position where she was at the end there. And obviously with Ruth, the decision to bring her back was really good. Again, I would say Ruth, in my opinion, had the best arc at the end of the season, but I felt like even if they didn't bring Rachel back, it would have been fine. But I did think it was like a nice like fan service moment, you know, and things like that.
Yeah, 100%. Like I said, it's the thing that every final season does where they end up bringing back kind of certain old characters, you know, got to give every one of those guys that have been in the show really since the beginning, you know, their just desserts. Of course, they couldn't do it for like some of the actually interesting characters. Like I said, probably my 3 favorite characters from the start of the show, who they kind of all killed off between the courses of seasons 1 and 2. Like I said, Del, Jacob, and Petty. You couldn't give any extra screen time to those guys. Couldn't bring any of those. I mean, it made sense because they finally killed Darlene, and so there was kind of no reason for them to bring that back. It just sucks because I really liked all those guys at varying different degrees, even though they were all kind of assholes. And so, but no, that, you know, they had the ghost of Wyatt and the ghosts of the rest of Ruth's family that she lost. I was honestly, I'll tell you this much though, I am actually completely shocked because they had this as a red herring for a couple different moments throughout the last couple episodes, specifically where you had her seeing the ghosts of all of her dead family members. And I'm like, okay, are we going to have the Titanic moment where like, as she's dying, because I figured out, I know this was a little bit of a shock for you. I figured out pretty early on, I'm like, Ruth is not making it out of this last season alive. I'm like, something is going to go down. I'm like, they're going to play around with it. I'm like, I don't know what it was that clued me in, but it's like, after a certain point, I was able to figure out which characters were going to stay alive and which ones were. But I'm like, look, we even talked about this with the last season. They're like, look, that this show, they need a blood sacrifice, to quote Succession. Like, they need to kill like one of the core 5 characters that have been around since the beginning. Because there really were. Like, there were only 5 characters that are still obviously survived since the first season, that being the core 4, Byrdes and Ruth. And I'm like, they need a blood sacrifice. One of those 5 has got to go by the end. You know, you and I, we had our theories at the end of last season. And obviously it sucks because once again, it was a situation where all of the theories that came up were all way more interesting and probably way more compelling than anything that we actually got, where Ruth unfortunately does end up meeting her demise in this finale. But of course, it ends up being really stupid how it comes about.
I
Just like
completely agree.
so many different things that happen. But like after a certain point, I'm like, okay, are they gonna have the Titanic ending where like Ruth is gonna like, as she's dying, she's gonna see her family members, they're gonna be like, come join us in the light, all the pain and suffering that you've suffered at the hands of these people, it's all over, come. They didn't do that. But honestly, after what we got, that might have actually been better, is what's crazy. Like, were you getting that sense? That the last couple episodes tripped me up a couple times there.
I wasn't quite getting the sense of that from when she was seeing her dead family members. Obviously, I think it was partially a fan service moment. Like I mentioned, there was quite a bit of that this last season, but I think it was more so kind of resembling her inner struggle and just kind of showing us, like kind of reminding us how much she's lost and how much she's suffered. And I think her kind of just seeing and interacting with her family members, especially in that one scene where Russ is playing the guitar, Cade's on the grill. It seems like they're, nothing ever changed from like before the season one started. And I think there's a little more significance to that personally. And it kind of just shows you how she really was struggling just so much. And she was never really talking to anyone about it. And that was her kind of coping mechanism. And I don't know. I don't know. It was pretty interesting, but
Yeah.
I like to give a little more credit to the writers for that than maybe you would, but
Well,
that's just me.
100%, because like I said, that's a moment that's like super over sentimentality based, could fail miserably, like you said, fan servicey, nostalgia baity, all that different stuff. And so for me, at least, it kind of comes down to, it's like, okay, what is this going to lead to, unfortunately, and ultimately with the payoff that we got, it just makes those scenes just so much more confusing in hindsight. Cause I'm like, what the hell was that even for? It's like, we know what she's lost, it's like kind of like, okay, so giving a visual sense of like what we as fans and what we as viewers have kind of already thought about the show, like that kind of stuff. It's like we that's already on our mind. So it's like, ultimately, if you're gonna give us that, you gotta actually have it lead somewhere, And it's like ultimately just showing more context. It's like, oh, Ruth's sad, she misses Wyatt. It's like, I mean, first of all, why anybody would miss that little twerp, I have no idea. And also just the fact that Wyatt completely got it over his head. It again, one of the worst storylines I think I've ever seen in any show, with him getting together with Darlene. I still have no idea what decided to prompt that. But just like, so obviously you have the whole cartel of it, and you figured that like the whole cartel of it was going to play a factor. Like I said, there was no way that Marty and Wendy were going to get out all completely. There was always this kind of dreading, overhanging sense that they were not going to be able to get out without something kind of sneaking up on them, something from their past. And again, there were so many different indicators, obviously, between Mel and Wendy's dad. And then obviously once it's discovered that Navarro's sister was behind, like, kind of, certain attempts on his life, because famously, Navarro has Marty go down to Mexico and manage in his absence. And all the while, Marty starts to like discover some discrepancies within his organization. All stuff that probably should have happened last season. I mean, they did the best that they could with it, obviously, just given the short amount of time that they had to tell with it, and uncovering this conspiracy where Javi's mother, who believes that Navarro was responsible for Javi's death, is now trying to take more of a major stake in the cartel. And let's talk about Javi's mother for a second. And once again, like the idea of like just a last minute antagonist that's kind of thrown in. As much as I love Breaking Bad kind of did fall victim to this as well, where you had these characters, the neo-Nazi cult that Todd introduced in the first half of season 5 that kind of sort of became like mainstay antagonists in the second half. I still don't think that the Breaking Bad did the best job that it possibly could, but you have this character that comes in out of nowhere, like in the last season. I have a big problem with this whenever they try to do this, whenever they try to bring in new characters and introduce like new plot lines in a season that's primarily wrap up, because more often than not, it ends up lending itself to failure. And you have this character that comes in that is trying to be like this mix between Shohreh Aghdashloo and Salma Hayek, as far as being like this whole, the men have come in and screwed up, so now it's like, the role of like the matronly mother has got to take over from that, but she's also going to get revenge. And like, I understand what they were trying to go for as far as building up, where it's like, oh, Marty and Wendy, they think that they're out. They think that they've managed to solve everything, but oh, nope, there's this one still hanging thing overhead. And like, just, I mean, that scene, let's rip the Band-Aid off. We've all been kind of circling around it. Like, Ruth's death. Like, what the fuck? Just, I've seen worse executed deaths. It's not the worst executed deaths I've ever seen. It's just, The reason why, like, I compare this to something like Atlanta this season, where it's so beyond frustrating because, like, they should be better than this. You know, they should be better than this. They should be able to come up with something that's inherently a lot more satisfying than this. But it's like, why? Like, what is the thought process that goes into something like that? You know?
I felt like they had kind of some of the right ideas behind it. Obviously, I kind of liked how they had her dressed in white, and obviously Javi's mother was in black, kind of
Little
resembling
on the
death.
nose there,
And
but that's part
yeah,
of the course for this show.
but I don't know, man. It just didn't have like the weight it should have.
Right.
Obviously, Ruth is, one of, a fan favorite. I mean, you think about her arc, where she began and where she ended up. Like she's building this huge, like, complex. She's gonna have a guest house, a giant pool, a mansion. Like, she really was. In my opinion, Ruth had the best arc of the whole show. But, it just, you think about all these other moments with Ruth, like when she was waterboarded in season 2, or, that her, towards the end of last season after Wyatt's death, and she's screaming at the Byrdes, like, or even the beginning of this season, right where it left off, where she's just like she had to pull over just to like pace around and scream. I mean, it felt like all those scenes just had way more emotion than her actual death. And that's just because it kind of just fell out of nowhere. It was something that kind of just happened the last like 10 minutes of the show, just oh, see that girl over there, yeah, kill her. It just didn't feel the same. I mean, yeah, I hate to be like that, but that's just how it was.
Well, yeah, because it ultimately takes, like you were saying, arguably the fan favorite character. A lot of people argue that she's like the most compelling character of the entire show, and you're just kind of just like, oh yeah, they're just treating her like another disposable character. Like, oh, she's got to be off, you know? And it's like, it's so much, it's so obvious and on the nose, like you said. She's in like the pearlescent white. She's ultimately the success story. She's ultimately been able to profit off of all the pain that has been heaped on her family as a result. But then no, you obviously have, Javi's mom, who comes out. It's the most ridiculously over the top macabre fashion with her like croaking
Mhm.
frog voice and dressed in the all black. It's like she's literally like death coming to claim Ruth. It's so on the nose. It's so obvious. It's so ridiculous. And then when the death actually happens, they give it the slow-mo treatment, and I'm like, oh wow,
Yeah,
we're really going for it here, And
yeah,
I'm just like, I'm like, it's so obvious and it's so on the nose, which I guess again is par for the course of the show. Like I said, this is literally coming off of a show that has had multiple deaths that should have been impactful, but just kind of end up being unintentionally hilarious because of how out of nowhere they feel. And this was kind of like the cherry on top of all that, where you have not quite a surprise death because, again, it's been built up to. She literally sees the car just sitting in the driveway, and then she walks out of the woods. And I'm like,
yeah,
so you had this whole thing in the last episode where you're calling Rachel and telling her like exactly what to do as far as with Nelson when he's coming for her. And you have this really tense and awesome moment that comes as a result of that. And then you just have this like slow, dragged out, oh, this is coming. And it's like, there's just something ultimately inherently unsatisfying where it felt like Ruth, not that she deserved it, because again, like this is a show where ultimately no character doesn't have dirt on their hands, just considering like what she has done over the course of the show. Like, she's ultimately just as culpable of Marty. So if we're gonna, like, just in order to like kind of quash any of like the legal quote unquote like the logistics of it and anything, but there's something that just inherently felt so unsatisfying where it's like, Ruth, really? And then that's before we even top it off with the final moment of the show, and just
oh,
how, like, besides how inconsistent they had, and this is how you know that the show is really feeling itself, where, so you have Ruth's death, which is inherently unsatisfying in and of itself, and then on top of that, you're going to try and do the Sopranos ending, you're going to try and do the cut to black ending, where it's like, wow, so we're really trying to like, we're really trying to pull the wool over people's eyes by showing, oh yeah, the Byrdes are like truly evil now, as if we didn't already know that to begin with. So like, I guess before we get into that last scene, I guess just like, is this show trying to like actually have put its characters in a moral stance and try and have them like pick a stance as far as like, oh, okay, they've kind of just accepted that they're all like evil shit bags, Because if that's the case, doesn't that ultimately go against what was established like 5 seconds earlier with them kind of like feeling bad about being put into like this stalemate, as far as like, the Javi's mom forcing them to not warn Ruth about her impending death, but then they're ultimately satisfied when Mel, who is literally like the last character on the show who is like trying to make a moral and conscionable decision, and then you have Jonah come out of nowhere, who is like gone out of his way to be like, yeah, you guys are like kind of amoralistic pieces of shit, but then comes out of nowhere and helps him and is like, family above all else. I'm like, well, what are we trying to go for here? It's like, don't get me wrong. I can pretty much go along with any message, regardless of whether I agree with it or not, as long as like it's picking a direction, stick with it. But the show is like bouncing from like one end of the spectrum to the other. And I'm just like, I'm like, give me something at the very least, Like, what are we doing here?
No, I completely agree. I think Dell, believe it or not, I think he was actually one of the more compelling and interesting characters this half of the season. I think it was a real step up
Oh, you
from.
mean Mel? For a second, I thought you were talking about Dal, but
Yeah,
hey, that
geez.
shows the overall creativity from these characters when it comes to coming up with these writers when it comes to coming up
Yeah.
with character names.
Yeah, my apologies, Mel. But I honestly was pretty invested in his character this half of the season. I thought he went in a pretty believable and interesting place where he's kind of, and when he was presented with this decision to get his old life back, become a cop, and it just, I felt like there was some real struggle there, and I thought it was pretty well executed, and I like the idea of him even like coming back and realizing that it wasn't enough and that he still kind of did the
Right.
wrong thing, and but it just was not executed right at
No.
all.
Like, yeah, you're
And even
100% on the money there because the Mel of it all, like I said, talk about a character that, like I said, was literally just thrown in kind of willy nilly out of nowhere in season 4, and then them kind of low key becoming like a pretty awesome character. Like by the time I ended, I'm like, wow, how am I actually like kind of rooting for this guy now to like kind
yeah,
of win overall? He ended up kind of the turning out to be a pretty compelling character, and that actor, Adam Rothenberg, props to him for like coming in and like giving like a pretty compelling performance in a end season of a show. I know that's pretty difficult to do just in general. But so you're right. The problem there is not with that character because that character ends up being like one of the most likable characters and arguably the character with the most moralistic stance where he's like, no, I'm not going to let one of your schemes, just work out kind of willy nilly. You're going to, you guys are, he's the last guy that's trying to hold them to task for it. And then like the problem is with the Jonah of it all, because it takes for me probably my personal favorite character of the show and just brings him down to Marty and Wendy's level, but like kind of out of nowhere. Like there's no like thread to like tie together like Jonah turning evil, especially because you spent the entire first half of this season back in January of basically establishing how much Jonah hated Wendy for her killing Ben. And now what? Because of they find out the truth about the grandpa. And that's that's the only thing I can think of. Like I
yeah.
said, I'm grasping at straws here as far as where it's gonna go.
No, I completely agree. I just think like a lot of elements set up in this first half of the season were just not paid off at all. I mean, obviously the car crash, just huge disappointment. That scene didn't even need to happen. The next scene they're just fine. Oh, we got into a bit of a car crash.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
obviously
and they end up trying to make some cockamamie statement about, oh, it's an act of God that's telling us that we're literally bulletproof. I'm like, okay, okay, so now you
it's
actually
like
think you're immortal. We're
I
gonna
get
introduce
the
God
message.
complexes at this point in the show.
Oh, absolutely. It's like I get the message, but it's just not the right way to portray it. And obviously, you think about, in the grand scheme of things, and pulling in Javi's mother just for that one last antagonist. In the grand scheme of things, I think it just would have been interesting if they just kept Javi around. And because
Yeah,
obviously Javi on his own was causing way more problems and in a
right.
much more interesting fashion than his mother was. And I felt like even though I did like his death and I did feel like there were enough elements to work with even after his death, I just felt like bringing in just a new character to essentially replace the damage he was doing, especially one who was not as well developed or not even as threatening. Obviously, Javi, he came in like that first episode, bam, he whacks the sheriff, someone who's been around since season 1, the very beginning. It's like, okay, anyone could die, we're here, it's the last season, and it's disappointing, in the grand scheme of things. And obviously, I mentioned earlier some characters that like we just don't know what happens to them in that last episode. You think about Agent Miller. The last time we see her, she's just saying, to Mel, if you make that decision, then I don't want to see you again. That's like the last time I can think of seeing her. And
Yeah.
you think of Rachel. What happens to her after she kills Nelson? We just don't see her again, and it's like, wow. And obviously, touching on that, I think obviously it was a really cool scene. I did enjoy that standoff with her and Nelson. I just felt like if anyone had to kill Nelson, it's just Rachel of all people.
Yeah.
Uh, I would have enjoyed it a little more personally if we got to see like someone like Jonah or Wendy maybe possibly take
Fuck
down one of the
that!
big
Make it
cartel
Ruth.
guys.
Make it
Or
Ruth. It's
Ruth,
like
absolutely.
because again, this is what these TV shows always have to do. It's been in time immemorial since The Sopranos, where they have a very clear setup and confrontation between two characters that have a very very justified reason for going after each other, and then they just completely skirt around it because they're like, oh, we gotta twist it for an expectation for whatever reason. So instead of
Yeah.
it's like Nelson is tracking Ruth, you think that it's gonna go down that way, and you're like, oh shit, is this about to go down? And then for whatever reason, he decides to go after Rachel instead. Like, what? Like,
Yeah.
it makes no sense, like at all.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree. And yeah, I mean just there were a lot of places they could have gone, and I just felt like they either chose the routes that just didn't have enough impact with them, or that some even didn't even need to see as much light as they did. Obviously, the subplot with the grandpa trying to take the kids away didn't make sense. I kind of didn't really like the way it ended, just with Ruth kind of just threatening him and just like get out. I thought it would
Almost
have been
like
a
they were
lot.
rushing it and just needed that storyline to just go away and wrap itself up.
I completely agree. I felt like it could have benefited from a few more episodes. I thought it would have been maybe more interesting if Wendy just decided to just go, evil again, just, as she does, and just have her own father killed. I
Yeah, and
mean,
no. What do they do instead? She literally just acts like a 3-year-old and just commits herself to an insane asylum. And I felt so bad because it's like I know how understaffed and how poor and how much poor funding those places get, and how actually incapable they actually are of performing their job. So that moment in itself just kind of hurt me in so
yeah.
many different ways that I was not expecting. I'm like, wow, Ozark, like I already hate these characters enough. Way to make me hate them even more.
Yeah, obviously that scene where she was like kind of just on her knees just begging him on the court steps. I was maybe thinking like, "Oh, is she going to obviously I mentioned to you when we were watching, like, oh, is she gonna do what she did with Darlene and try and get him to, act on his violent impulses and hit her and, show the kids like this is why you can't be with him? But just no, there was no scheming. And on that note, it kind of brings me to the finale when they're kind of faced with this decision, like, do we help Ruth, someone who's like been there for us since the beginning and who's done so much and has lost so much and you know there's just you think maybe there's this hope that the Byrdes are going to pull off one last scheme and save her, or maybe at the consequence of like maybe Marty or Wendy dying or something, just doing the right thing, like but they just don't. They just kind of sit back and like, oh, she threatened the kids, like that hasn't happened before, right? And
Yeah.
it just feels so underwhelming in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah,
Just
100%. Couldn't agree with you more. Like my biggest thing is it's just like like you said, it's just like I'm flummoxed because I don't think I've seen this before where it's like you have all the, and it's funny because I brought up the comparison to Game of Thrones, but I guess the difference between this and Game of Thrones is Game of Thrones, it was very, very apparent that even though they did have the seeds there, they just wanted to be done. They just wanted to wrap it up. Benioff
yep.
and Weiss were just tired. They just were not as invested those last couple seasons. They had the shorter episode count. And again, just the production for those last 6 episodes alone was just so big and involved so many different moving pieces that like they
Oh
were just
yeah.
probably beyond exhausted and they just wanted to get out of there. And we know that they were considering offers from like, different studios. Like I said, they had a Netflix deal, they had an HBO deal for their new show, they had a Disney deal to do a Star Wars movie, all of which ended up falling through, of course, which is why, again, you never count your chickens before they've hatched. But like that, but that's one thing. I guess just the thing that's so frustrating and unsatisfying here is that this definitely didn't seem to be the case. This was a situation where, again, the writers, I feel like, probably had all the leeway in the world. They probably had all the space and all the time in the world, just given the fact that this was it. This was one of the few shows that Netflix was actually going to let go through to its final conclusion. That Netflix was not going to cancel this abruptly after 3 seasons. Like just the fact that this made it to the first show, I feel like, since House of Cards and Orange is the New Black that actually made it roughly past 4 seasons. That's impressive to say the least. And I don't know if this is because of the pandemic or how this affected anything or not. We obviously know that there was another 2-year gap between these past 2 seasons and season 3. What's it called? But I don't understand how, after an entire decade of seeing different examples of how these types of stories on TV have gone horrifically wrong in the past, how you don't ultimately learn from that. Like I said, there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that we probably don't know about that probably went into the making of it, as goes into the making of everything. But it's just so difficult to believe that with a show that is, for the most part, this succinct and this unified in its vision for them to just kind of deviate this far, you know? So I guess that's kind of where the frustration comes from as far as this kind of being added to the pantheon of unsatisfying TV finales, most of which I've gone back on and admitted they are not nearly as bad as a lot of people and a lot of pop culture have made them out to be. Famously for me, the only finales that I've seen that I think are truly, truly bad, besides Game of Thrones, are Lost, How I Met Your Mother, and Dexter. Those are really the only other three that I'm like, they really, really screwed these up. You know, they really just completely fucked this up. And I'm not going to say that this is quite along the lines of those, but like it's kind of circling around there, you know, it's kind of just around there where it's like, no, they had the chance. They had all the opportunities in the world. They had all the backing and everything. This was like one of their most watched shows on a service that is slowly losing credibility by the day. And they just completely screwed the pooch. So unfortunately, it looks like in hindsight, we're going to look back on this and be like, yep, this was just yet another nail in Netflix's very, very slow coffin. Like, and I guess this kind of brings us into the larger discussion of Netflix, which is kind of, I wanted to ask you this as well, which is where do we think Netflix is going to go in the next couple of years? Because obviously the idea of Netflix will always kind of be like a staple of the culture because Netflix in and of itself has kind of transcended what it was originally, which was again, just this, this kind of revolutionary new way to watch media and to watch and view media that's now obviously become the norm just because of, you know, how we access and how we view media. But like, just given, you know, what's happened in the streaming wars just these last few years in the pandemic, and as a result of the pandemic and obviously of Netflix's bafflingly stupid business decisions behind the scenes. Like they're going to introduce like an ad tier, and they're going to crack down on password sharing, which is going to lose them more subscribers than they're already losing, and their unbelievably ridiculously expensive prices, and just their overall lack of content in their library, and just the fact that we all know what it comes from. It comes from the fact that unlike the rest of these streamers, their streaming and their production is the focus of their business, and unfortunately, it is just not winning them any favors because their outlook has always been on quantity over quality, and that unfortunately has been kind of a big contributor to why it is so difficult for any of these streamers to make money, because they don't have like kind of the one thing that people circle around and focus on. They don't really prioritize value in their services. So like, I guess just like, does this spell out anything for Netflix, or is this kind of just like yet another like small piece in like the slow crumbling of the Netflix empire, of the stronghold that they've had over us over like the last 5 to 6 years roughly?
In terms of the crumble, I don't think it's a small piece. I think this is a bigger piece. It makes you wonder how much of their struggle really did impact that finale. Maybe at the last second, you know, maybe they were just like, actually, you know what? We're losing a lot of money. You know, we need to stick with what people are watching. Let's try and shoot and possibly set up another season of this. It makes you wonder, like that could have very well happened. And obviously with a lot of the loose ends left open, who knows at this point. But I mean, Netflix has lost close to, I believe, 300,000 subscribers since they announced the changes with the ads and, you know, the $20 a month, you know, price change.
Not to mention their stock options have plummeted. Like I think this is the lowest their stock has been since 2015, right when Daredevil came out.
Actually, it's since like the mid 2000s, actually, right close when they were starting up. Yep, they've lost over 35% of their shares, and equating to about like 54 billion in the market total. I mean, it's a huge tank. They're projected to lose more than another 1 million subscriptions by the end of the year, and it just makes you it makes you wonder. Like they probably, for so long, Netflix was kind of just used to being the big dog. You know, we were the first one. We're the pioneer for this new industry, and just between like their debt issues and their poor management, it just they got a little too cocky, I think. And now you see, you know, Apple TV Plus and, you know,
Disney Plus, HBO Max, all the different streamers that popped up. Hulu finally becoming actually like worth watching, you know, Amazon and everything that they were doing. You know, it's just like it's a combination of, like you said, poor management, overconfidence in their product. The fact that they kind of went an entire year with literally like seemingly that they went a couple of years with seemingly no competition, and all these other streamers just came out of nowhere, bought up all the IP that Netflix had that was actually worth watching, and then implemented a release strategy that was just so much more beneficial to people's viewing habits. Again, like you said, Netflix got overconfident. They had the binge model running so long that it kind of ended up running out of steam, and now it just feels exhausting to binge watch a show. Like you said, 7 episodes that we kind of had to binge watch over the course of 2 days and even that felt like a freaking chore, Whereas now, because every other streaming service has implemented some variation and version of the week-to-week viewing, which is so much more palatable and just so much more friendly to people's already limited time since going back to work post the pandemic. It's just like that Netflix was ultimately, they were playing a very, very dangerous game that was not going to last super long. And now they are unfortunately seeing the consequences of their actions, to say the least. So the only thing that I can say is I'm a little bit sad because there were still a few things that I was still invested in with Netflix. I wanted to see how Cobra Kai was going to wrap up. I was interested to see where The Witcher and Arcane were going to go because I still think that The Witcher had potential. Arcane was one of my favorite shows that came out last year. I'm still hoping that those shows can still kind of survive amongst all the Netflix mess and kerfluffle. But yeah, so with that being said, final, with the Netflix of it all, I just wanted to talk about that for a bit. Final star rating on this season of Ozark, and then your overall kind of final thoughts in terms of like saying goodbye to Ozark.
Well, personally, I would probably give this season, I would say a 6 out of 10, so 3 stars. I do think there were some highs. I think that scene where Marty and Wendy got into the fight with the driver was just,
that was hilarious. That was the highlight of the season for me.
In my opinion, one of the best scenes of the show. I just felt like it was a great just symbolism of just Marty and Wendy's dynamic, and just how they act to people. They're always bickering internally, and then when someone else comes to threaten them, then they kind of unify to kick some butt. And obviously, I just think it was, even during that altercation, Wendy was still undermining Marty when Marty says, get out of your car, and Wendy's like, go back in your car.
Funny. Oh, it was so funny. I was laughing that whole time. That was the funniest scene of the entire show for me.
Oh my gosh, absolutely brilliant. But yeah, no, I would say overall give this season 3 out of 5 stars. And I would say that even though the ending is a little disappointing from, the high standards the show set very early on, I still think the show's worth a watch, and I would still recommend it to people. You think about the highs of this show, I think the highs are worth this one, kind of big low, but in the end, I would still say it's worth a watch, and it's been a wild ride. Still gonna be one of my personal favorite shows, kind of like the first half of Game of Thrones. I'm still gonna love it, even though I know where it leads. And
yeah, trust me. As somebody who is literally doing a week by week recap of Game of Thrones, I completely understand where you're coming from there as far as the love of this show. Look, what I'll say on this final season and kind of on my wrap up of Ozark, because like you said, even though I've not been as big a fan of this show as you have, this show has still been a tremendous part of my life these last couple of years. I'll still never forget when I watched it the first time, and then kind of like how my family members started to get into it, and me realizing I'm like, oh, this is not just going to be a show that just I kind of watch and love. This is going to be a show that a lot of people are going to watch and really, really enjoy. And from where it started to where it went now, it definitely kind of went in a direction that I was not at all a fan of, but it was still one of the most watchable, one of the most relevant, one of the most engaging shows of the last couple of years, even though it did end up kind of becoming a little bit of a pulpy soap opera. I'm definitely more so a fan of the first 2 seasons than the last couple of seasons overall, where they went. Couple storytelling decisions that I wasn't a fan of that ultimately resulted in an unfortunately kind of disappointing finale. But overall, it's a mid-tier show. I'm going to be really interested to see what people's reactions are going to be going forward. If people end up like kind of finding the show after the fact, and it'll be really interesting to see like what hindsight is going to kind of bring on the show as a result of, versus like kind of being in the moment and watching it as it was airing. Still, for me, the biggest source of credit goes to Jason Bateman, who was like besides just acting in the show, been one of the creators fueling the show, in addition to the 2 creators, Bill Dubuque and Mark Williams, producing, directing several of the episodes throughout the course of this show, as well as
basically making Julia Garner's career.
Exactly. Yeah, pretty much, so Bateman for me is the winner for this. Bateman was already kind of like a household name beforehand, but this like really solidifies that this was like his apex tier. I'll be really interested to see what he does after this, whether he kind of goes back to comedies or whether he sticks with more serious work, because he has proven that like his kind of like nervous tics and his like kind of mumbling style of acting, but fast talking style of acting really, works well for this type of material. And like I said, it was a really different and really interesting and engaging type of performance from him. Like I said, varying performances from all the different actors involved. But yeah, it's certainly, like I said, any show like this that has lasted for this long is certainly worth commemorating on its ending. So even though I'm only giving the show as a total, I'll boost it up a little bit as a whole. This season for me is probably like my lowest rating since season 3. I'm going to give this like a 2.5 out of 5 for this season. But overall for the show, I'm going to give the entire show in its entirety roughly a 3.5, you know? So now the only thing that we'll that we'll leave off with before we get out of here is where would you rank all 5 seasons of this show?
Oof, good question. Personally, I've thought about this for quite a while. I can't really pick a favorite between part 1 of 4 and just the first season. For me, they're kind of my two favorites, interchangeable, 1 and 2. Then I would maybe put 2 at number 3, and then 3 at number 4, and then obviously this ending last part of
Yeah,
season 4 at
roughly around the same
third
for me. For me,
place.
one is Apex God tier. Like I'll never be able to. I never once got back the feeling watching this show, the subsequent seasons that I did watching that first season, just being like, whoa, what the hell is
Mhm.
this? I've never seen anything like this before. That pilot episode and everything they pulled off, I'm just like, Jesus Christ! Like
Yep.
I've never seen storytelling this intense and this crazy before, and it was just kind of like enough momentum to like sustain it for that entire season. Then I would put the first half of season 4. Then season 2, like season 2 is neck and neck. I'm probably like a season 2 defender. Like there are a lot of people that kind of like I feel like overlook season 2, but there's a lot I think of awesome stuff that still happens in season 2.
Oh, I
Then
completely agree.
then for me, it's between season 3 and this most recent season, battling it out for the worst spot. I am famously, as much as people love season 3, I am not a fan of season 3 at all. I really, really do not enjoy it. I'm not a fan of how they characterize Wendy's brother or where they took that struggle and everything. And then just this season, which kind of just like a fart and like, okay, we got to get out of here. You know, that's kind of
Yeah.
where they ended up leaving off. So with that being said, that is it. That's it for Ozark. It's done. It's finished, people. In order to quote the post-credit scene in Ferris Bueller, it's over. What are you still doing here? Go out, live the rest of your lives. Whatever he was saying at the end of that iconic movie. So, Eli, thank you once again for joining me. This will not be the last time that people see you on the podcast. Where can the good people follow you on the interwebs?
That's a good question. Basically, the only public thing I have is an Instagram. So if you do want to follow me, my username is E_Holicky. It's HOLICKY 45. That's again E_Holicky 45 on Instagram. Yeah.
Of course.
So
Of course, be sure to follow him with everything he's got going on. Be sure to follow myself at Movie Nerd Reviews across all platforms. Be sure to follow the official Talking TV podcast across all social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of the above. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube if you're not already. Be sure to also follow us on Twitch if you've been listening with us. We've had an absolute blast. This is one of a couple different TV finales that we're going to be hitting. Obviously we still have Better Call Saul, Atlanta, Stranger Things, a bunch of different shows that come back. Barry, obviously, once that season wraps up, we'll probably end up doing something for that. This is kind of the year of the return of a lot of our favorite shows. We're going to be tracking them as they continue to go out. A lot of new shows that are still obviously being broadcasted. And obviously next weekend, we got a big one, people. We're officially kicking off our summer series next weekend with the return of the multiverse. Only a few short months after debut with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. So make sure you guys tune in next week for that one. We're going to have a lot of things to say on that episode. Matt of Basic Entertainment and Luke of Luke Reviews will both be joining us for that episode. But as always, people, until next time, 12 seasons in a short film and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.